So let's take a few minutes and just look at the process of digestion. And we're going to look at it in terms of hormones first, looking at the major hormones and what they do, and then kind of put it all together and go through the phases. Even though this particular recording isn't going to talk about all the structures and all the organs and all their functions, you still need to know them. So again, we're just going to focus on hormones and the digestive process. In lecture, I mentioned all these hormones, but I didn't get to spend much time on them. So this is my opportunity to do that. So the hormones are, in no particular order, cholecystokinin. We're going to refer to it as CCK. This is the one that's mostly associated with fats. So if you eat fat, you're going to have CCK release. Then we have gastrin. But there's two gastrins. One's secreted by the stomach, the other secreted by the intestine. So gastrin with the G is gastric gastrin. Gastrin is almost always secreted, and it's going to help the stomach increase its activity. Another hormone we're going to see is our friend histamine. We know histamine stimulates inflammation from the past. But if you think about what histamine does, it makes sense that we see it here. Histamine increases permeability of capillaries. Also, we have the other gastrin secreted by the intestine, so intestinal gastrin. We're going to see it associated with motility of the intestinal tract. And then lastly, another hormone called secretin, kind of also a little bit with fat digestion. So let's look at a chart of all these hormones and then work our way through. Here's the ugly chart. I'll give a handout of this in class, but it's also on the blackboard. So the first one we had listed was CCK. CCK is secreted by the duodenum. The stimulus is when the chyme that enters the duodenum has a lot of fat in it and some partially digested protein. So let's say you ate a hamburger or you ate a pound of butter or something like that. The target for CCK is the liver and the pancreas. And before we get into the activity, let's just think about why. When you eat fats and some protein, you're going to need a lot of enzymes to help you break down the proteins and break down the fats. You're also going to have to get bile from where it was stored down to the duodenum. So now let's look at the function of CCK and keep in mind, what do we need? We need bile. And we need some specific enzymes. Well, one of the things we see CCK doing is it potentiates secretin. It makes secretin work even better. And we're going to get to secretin in a second, but even if we just look at it, it comes out when you have fat and partially digested protein. Its target organs are going to be different, and its activity is different, but secretin and CCK almost go hand in hand. All right, back to CCK. Now remember, CCK, you ate protein and a lot of fat. And so we're going to need all the things to help us deal with the fat and the protein. So one of the things CCK does once it's secreted is it stimulates contraction of the gallbladder. That makes sense. Remember, we just ate fat, so we need bile to emulsify it. And bile is stored in the gallbladder. And we only release bile when we need it. So our mechanism for controlling bile release is CCK. So again, you eat fat, CCK gets secreted by the duodenum, it finds its way to the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder, and it's going to cause the gallbladder to start contracting so that it squishes out its bile. Well, that bile would now go down cystic duct, common bile duct, and find its way to the hepatopancreatic ampulla. And remember, there's a sphincter muscle there. So it doesn't do any good to get bile there if we can't get it past the sphincter. So the other thing CCK does is it relaxes the hepatopancreatic sphincter so that it opens and that bile can now go into the duodenum where that fatty chyme is. The other thing CCK does is it inhibits acid secretion in the stomach. Acid is great for digesting, partially digesting the proteins and even starting acid hydrolysis of carbohydrates. It does not help us when we have a lot of fat. And lastly, one of the things CCK does is it stimulates the pancreas to make and secrete lipase enzymes and protease enzymes to help us break down that fat and that protein. So that's CCK. Remember, what triggers it is a fatty chyme, partially digested proteins. And to kind of differentiate it from secretin, if I ask about CCK, I'm going to give you an example of a lot of fat, like you ate a stick of butter or you ate a Big Mac, something like that. Now let's take a look at gastrin. This is gastric. Gastrin. It's secreted by G cells in the stomach. The trigger for releasing it is acetylcholine release, but also just the presence of food in the stomach. So gastric gastrin gets secreted in the gastric phase. Its targets are the parietal cells, small intestine, ileocecal valve, oops, typo, large intestine, and even the stomach itself. So gastric gastrin has a lot of targets. And again, before we look at its function, let's think about when it's released. It's released because food entered the stomach. Well, what do we need to have when we trigger the gastric phase? We need the stomach to start moving. We need the stomach to start secreting. And I mentioned in lecture, once you trigger digestion, all the parts of the alimentary canal actually start moving in preparation. So one of the things you're going to see with this hormone is we're going to stimulate a lot of motility. So again, gastric gastrin is released by the stomach. The trigger is the fact that food enters the stomach, so this is the beginning of the gastric phase. It has a lot of targets, and it's really associated with stomach activity and digestion and stimulating a lot of movement. So now let's look at its activities. It triggers hydrochloric acid secretion. It helps control movement of the stomach in churning and then in doing peristalsis. It relaxes the ileocecal valve. Oddly enough, I love to misspell the word valve. It stimulates mass movements in general, and it also stimulates contraction of the intestine. So you can see gastric gastrin stimulates motility of stomach, small intestine, and large intestine, and increases acid secretion in the stomach. Well, during the gastric phase, we also make histamine. The stomach's mucosa makes it, and again, same trigger, food in the stomach. It acts on itself, and it solely activates parietal cells, and then we talked about the fact that with a capillary, it's going to increase permeability. Later on, blah, 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 absorption, blah, blah. But as far as it is here, we're talking about it in terms of parietal cells. Simple. Then we have our other gastrin, intestinal gastrin. It is secreted by the duodenum, and it is secreted at the beginning of the intestinal phase when an acidic chyme enters the duodenum. Intestinal gastrin, oddly enough, will act on the stomach, stimulating gastric glands and secretion, and timing. So it actually helps the stomach and the intestine coordinate with each other. So it helping to change activity in the stomach, turn it off, increase activity in the intestine. And then lastly, we mentioned secretin already, secreted by the duodenum, and you can see an acidic chyme, partially digested proteins. If you have a chyme that's hypertonic or hypotonic, or even irritants. So if you eat a little digested protein, you'll have secretin production. You also have secretin production if you eat something that is irritating, like very, very acidic, like not food poisoning, but you just eat something that doesn't sit right. If you've ever had that happen, you just ate something and the food itself wasn't bad, but your body obviously didn't like it, and you're just unsettled and you don't feel good. That would be another stimulus for secretin production. It acts on stomach and pancreas, and because it's associated with protein and a little fats, you see this overlap with bile output and pancreatic juice. It also helps shut the stomach off. So let's put these to work. Again, CCK associated with fatty things and a little bit of protein. So you can see relaxes hepatopancreatic sphincter, stimulates gallbladder contraction. It's going to inhibit acid production in the stomach because acid isn't helpful for digesting butter, and we already used it for the protein anyway. We increase an enzyme-rich pancreatic juice, and we make secretin work better. Gastric, gastrin. Stimulates histamine release, increases acid production. Remember, this one is all about the gastric phase. Stimulates gastric movement and emptying, and then actually acts on the rest of the alimentary canal to stimulate motility. Histamine, gastric phase, parietal cells. Intestinal gastrin. Intestinal phase, but coordinates activity of stomach and intestine. And secretin, when an acidic chyme with partially digested proteins or very hyper or hypotonic enters the duodenum, or if you have irritants in that chyme. It inhibits, it's going to shut the stomach off, so inhibit gastric secretion and motility, increase pancreatic juices, and increase bile. This is because of the overlap to eating fats and proteins, and that for timing. So let's look at phases, and again, the overall process. We already said in lecture that we begin digestion with a cephalic phase. Think about, smell, taste, look at food. And so that's cerebral cortex. So using some reflexes, especially on our vagus nerve, we're going to do two things. We're going to use our vagus nerve to stimulate chief cells and parietal cells so that we get gastric secretions. We get gastrin production, which stimulates histamine, which potentiates the parietal cells. And then that gastrin also stimulates contractility and all of those things. So what happens is we start getting more and more hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, which will get converted to pepsin to allow us to start breaking down proteins. So that food entered the stomach. Stomach has been making its secretion. Stomach's been very motile thanks to gastrin and reflexes. And now we've converted that bolus of food to chyme. Well, we did all that using our gastric phase. And you can see that even though we trigger this phase when food enters the stomach, very similar events take place. So we're just getting more and more. And again, once we convert that bolus into chyme, some of that chyme begins to enter the duodenum. So that stretches the duodenum, and then just the chemical presence of certain things in the duodenum stimulate the intestinal phase. So we're going to use a reflex. And depending on what we eat, we're going to secrete CCK and secretin. We're going to act on activity in the stomach to coordinate it with the intestine. We're going to stimulate intestinal secretion. We're going to stimulate pancreatic juice, etc. Once we do all that, then we can do chemical digestion in the intestine. All those enzymes coming in from the pancreas will break polymers to monomers. We start absorbing the monomers. And just to point out that, our pancreas is an accessory organ, but it is by no means lazy. So we can see that it gets controlled in our intestinal phase. Secretin has an act on it. CCK acts on it. Neural reflexes act on it. And you can see the stimulus is a little bit different. Okay, reflexes are because of chemoreceptors and pressure receptors. CCK is because of fat and some proteins. Secretin is, the chyme is more acidic. That's either because there's irritants in it, or they secreted too much acid, or a little bit of overlap with its friend CCK. You can see that each hormone affects the pancreas slightly differently. CCK is really going to stimulate a lot of bile and pancreatic enzyme, and even though there's overlap to secretin, because one of its stimulus is more acid, it's actually helping to try to neutralize the acid by making more bicarb stimulus from the pancreas. And then the reflexes are all about mucus and fluid and motility. So this is a different picture of the same concept. Remember, cephalic phase stimulates cerebral cortex and hypothalamus, and via reflexes we begin secretions and motility in the stomach. Then you swallow. Food enters the stomach, so you stretch it, or simply there's chemicals present in the stomach now. The food, the actual chemical stimuli, results in gastrin, which increases stomach secretion and activity. The physical distension is going to stimulate reflexes, long and short reflexes, that also increase stomach secretion and activity. Once the stomach has made all its secretions and it has been churning this entire time, that converts the bolus into chyme, and chyme begins to leak into the small intestine. The presence of chemistry in the small intestine and the fact that you stretch it stimulates the intestinal phase, which causes intestinal gastrin, CCK, secretin, and we see a change in events. And just to notice that, like you can stimulate anything, you can inhibit other things as well. When you get depressed, stressed out, whatever, you lose your appetite. Doesn't happen to me, but I've read about it in books. If your stomach is excessively acidic, like there's an irritant, and so you made too much acid, you inhibit the system. If you're under sympathetic nervous system distress, you inhibit the system. So you can follow it down. You can see that just like you can stimulate, you can also inhibit. And we talked about this in class, the fact that once you hit the small intestine, the goal of the small intestine is a lot of chemical digestion and then absorption. So that's pretty much it. We covered the hormones, their effects, and what stimulates their release, how different foods you eat can dictate physical activity and secretions, and how that kind of relates to those three phases.